Welcome to the Colors of Gaming, also known as COG. We're here today to talk about one of Blue's favorite games?
Yes, I would say it's one of my favorites.
All right, and its name is
Bendy and the Ink Machine.
Why did you pick this one?
The style and the gaming genre is just something that I find quite interesting. I don't think that style has really been done much before. And the genre, to begin with, I just haven't really been a fan of. And Bendy and the Ink Machine has changed that for me.
When you're talking about the style, I think what we're talking about is kind of like Outlast, sort of teetering on that horror/walking simulator. I would say that for me personally, that genre is not my favorite. I have played Outlast. I've played some other games. I've never found a game that I liked that was in that genre. And Inky does some things that I think are right, but at the same time, I don't think it really changed my mind. What do you like about this one?
The 1920s, 1930s-esque theme I've never really seen done before. And with the cartoon industry of that era being dominated by Disney, it's kind of nice just to see a different spin on it, kind of see the creativity of what goes on in an animation studio go wild. I found quite interesting.
The premise is pretty cool. You play as this character named Henry, and you've been called to your ex job by this character named
Joey Drew.
He wants you to come over to show you something, and I don't know what else I can say without spoilers other than things get kind of out of hand and crazy and creepy. There's some horror elements to this game. Surprisingly, there's some kind of combat mechanics in it as well.
And that's a big part of the reason why I like Bendy and the Ink Machine, is because in this kind of genre, you're just running the whole time. You don't really have a defense or even an offense, to where with this one, it definitely does give you options. And I never really felt like I got pushed into a corner that I couldn't get my way out of.
While there is combat mechanics, and I like that about it, I didn't feel like the combat was very fleshed out. There were certain instances in the game where I felt like because of how the combat was, you weren't going to make it out alive unless you exploited the game.
I didn't really notice it. I felt like the melee aspects of it felt pretty good for it, and I felt that they were in short enough bursts to where they didn't outstay their welcome. It's definitely a step in the right direction for sure.
It's still better than the majority of these kind of horror games. Another thing that you brought up was the art style and just the cartoon aspect of that. I really like the way this game looks. There are a lot of really cool ideas within the characters. An example is Bendy looks pretty sinister, pretty scary, and I can understand why there's such a fan base around these characters when they're so well designed.
One thing I would like to point out with Bendy's character design, which I think helps the scary and creepy factor, is when he walks, he has like a little limp to him. You can see the bonal and spinal structure, very anorexic looking, but he can outrun you, and he's running through walls and doing stuff that someone with that kind of body physique and bone structure should not be able to do. So I feel like it adds a whole new level onto the fear aspect.
I never personally was like afraid of Bendy, but I would say that yes, he's still pretty creepy. Throughout the whole game, he's kind of this sinister being that feels like he's always present in some way, and you're kind of nervous that he's just gonna pop out. And I could see that being a pretty good draw to the game. The thing that these characters reminded me of was when the game Epic Mickey was being announced. They released a bunch of concept art, and I thought it was cool to see these like twisted versions of Disney-esque characters, which we're never gonna get out of Disney. So it was cool to see in this game. The majority of the game is running around collecting things so that you can progress onward. I'm okay with that style of game, but in certain aspects or certain areas of this, I thought that it was a little repetitive.
I personally felt like it jumped between the fetch quests and the combat and the running to where it didn't feel super repetitive.
Are you ready to go into more depth into spoilers?
Yes. Just a quick recap on Chapter 1. All that really happens in Chapter 1 is you're introduced to the game and you turn on the ink machine, and then Bendy chases you, and now you're stuck in the lower floor. Chapter 2 is really when it introduces you into a lot of the combat mechanics, and that's when you are given an axe and you fight your first enemy type. Nothing super elaborate, but I will say I think they're a good starter enemy type, and you're in the music department, so you just see how music is created in these animation studios.
Yeah, I did like how as you progress into the game, you're going into different areas of this studio. They did introduce previously that there's like little tape recordings that you collect and you can listen to, sort of similar to something like a BioShock, where you can listen to these tapes and learn about what happened before you got here. I enjoyed that, and it kind of introduces you into that there's some office politics going on. Some people don't like each other. Some people are going crazy. There's some weird things that were happening happening inside this studio that no one quite understands. I did like that a lot, and it also shows you that there is some puzzle elements to this.
The puzzle elements, I felt like some of them were a little more elaborate than they should have been, and some of them were just as simple as they needed to be. One of the problems I do have with the game is with the triggered events. So there were times where we could not progress in the game until we walked to this certain area for a certain dialogue to queue, and that got kind of frustrating.
I can understand why, because you want a scripted, streamlined approach to gaming so that you can tell your story. But as a player, it can be a little bit annoying. I did like, however, the puzzle where you have to play the different instruments. I thought that was pretty fun.
Yeah, I will have to say I do like it in games when you have to listen to a specific tape and actually listen to it to know what to do next, instead of your objectives telling you exactly how to do it step by step.
In the middle of this chapter, it introduces you to Sammy Lawrence. He's a composer that has kind of went a little cuckoo and now is worshiping Bendy, right?
Yeah, I mean, let's get real here. Everyone's had music teachers. They're kind of their own unique breed these days. But he's just a couple bolts short. He starts to worship Bendy, and I found this part kind of funny and kind of cool is as he ties you into this chair to get you ready for like lamb to the slaughter, and he's trying to summon Bendy, so essentially Bendy could kill you and eat you or whatever he does to his victims. But instead, Bendy goes after Sammy, and you hear over the intercom that Bendy's just beating the crap out of him or whatever, and gives you a chance to escape. I thought was kind of ironic.
Yeah, I think that's kind of fun whenever like a villain gets killed by the thing that they're trying to gain and stuff like that. I thought that was interesting. I will say though that this part for me is kind of an example of something that I don't really like, and it's that when you're tied up and Bendy's coming after you, this instrumental score starts to ramp up. It kind of almost sounds like a teapot, like getting hotter and hotter and hotter when it lets off steam. I am not really a huge fan of that kind of instrumental just because I feel like it's used so often, and it's gotten to the point where I'm completely numb to the intense effects of that kind of soundtrack. Personally, I never was really super worried that we were going to get killed by Bendy. I don't really know why. That's just something that happened.
At the very end of chapter 2 is when you run into Boris, and he's the first character that you see that he's not grotesque, he's not twisted, he doesn't even talk, but he's just normal. And then that's when it leads into chapter 3.
You end up with this character named Boris. We had recently seen his corpse in the first chapter. While this was happening, I was a little bit confused just because I thought that he was dead. That's explained later on in the game, kind of, which I did like, but it does beg the question, why is Henry so comfortable with these cartoon creatures running around? I never heard Henry like scream at any of the ink monsters. He seems very, very familiar with Boris, and I didn't understand. It started to make me wonder if Henry himself was a cartoon, or if this whole world was a cartoon, or if this world just was okay with cartoons running around, similar to like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I just didn't quite understand the rules of this universe.
He is the artist of these characters. In the first chapter, as you go into one of the art rooms, he states that when he left, they had to get a couple people to replace him. So with him being as comfortable as he was with Boris, I always just attribute it to that these were his characters, he drew them, so I would imagine that as he's doing these different animations and these drawings of them, I'm sure like any other artist, he created these characters, he bonded with them, he talked with them. And that's what I attributed to how calm he was with talking to Boris, is that this isn't the first time he's talked to Boris.
One thing that I do like about this is that Boris is kind of a fun character because he doesn't let you out of the room until you cook him something. And I thought that was kind of fun. It was kind of cute because you learn how Boris is. He's just like a dog. He wants to eat food. So you got to make him food and he'll let you out. So then we go into chapter 3. After you feed Boris, you're let out of this room. You come to this toy store named like the Heavenly Toy Store, and you meet this character, or you're at least introduced to the idea of this character named Alice.
Yeah, Alice Angel, from what I could gather, she was supposed to be like the companion love interest to Bendy, but also to surpass him, much like the history of Betty Boop herself. But as you listen to some of these tapes, you come to find out that the Alice toy line is not selling, and one of the toy makers actually makes a comment that the only way they're going to get rid of these Alice figures is if they melt them down, which kind of goes to show that the company itself was struggling with Alice when they thought she was going to be a winner.
I will say that Alice is a pretty tragic character, and she's sort of the main villain throughout this, other than Bendy. You have a little bit more interaction with Alice than anybody else because she starts to give you these missions to like go and gather a bunch of things. And And I would say that this is probably the longest chapter in the whole game. You have to grab a bunch of different things.
That's when you find out that Alice has actually been through the ink machine twice instead of just once like every other character. Later, as you're doing these quests for her, Bendy starts to pop up again, which I really like because I felt like when it came to the point that you felt comfortable, you didn't feel in danger, that's when Bendy pops up, and so you have to be more cautious again. And you find out that Alice and Bendy are having a turf war, and you're just caught in the middle of it.
I would agree that Bendy definitely makes you feel uneasy throughout the whole game. You never know when he's going to quite pop up. I personally don't find the runaway until you find a safe spot mechanic very fun, though. There's not much depth to it, which kind of bothers me. And I think that the argument against that is that it's a scary game, so there shouldn't be. You just need to run away. But for me, I just like things that are more messes with your head than some kind of killer chasing after you. One iteration of this kind of character that I did like, though, in this chapter was the projection man. He had this projector for a head, and I did like this part because it flashes this light at you as you're running away, and it makes it pretty creepy. I think that it kind of sets this atmosphere of this scary creature chasing you. This is also where the Butcher Gang is introduced. Now, I love the Butcher Gang because I think that their character designs are really cool.
Yeah, when we're first introduced to the Butcher Gang, it reminds me of Sid from Toy Story when he's taking 2 or 3 different toys and just mashing them together to make one. They're creepy and you don't really want to touch them or get near them at the same time, so I felt like the Butcher Gang was a great character design.
There's one character that has his head like disconnected from his body. It's like hanging from a wire or something. And the first time I saw him, this was the first and only time in the game when I was like, what the hell is that? Because it started coming out of the shadows and it was really creepy to see. Another thing that I really like about this chapter, which I don't know if it's that big of a deal, but I liked it, is in a lot of these games that are kind of atmospheric, there's these characters that write messages on the walls. And one of the messages is, I don't want to work here anymore. And I just found that really funny because I'm imagining like it's like their first day at the cartoon place and they just see this message written in blood. I don't want to work here anymore. I just really liked it.
Or they have like OSHA or their corporate people come walk through doing their inspection, and that's what they see written on the wall.
Yeah, I mean, shut that shit down like right now because nobody wants to work there.
Better get overtime for this.
Eventually, you return back to Alice, and she kind of lets you go, and then she like decides not to let you go.
Yeah, as you're taking the elevator all the way to the top floor, she just keeps laughing. You're like, whatever, she's just crazy doing her thing. And then she drops the elevator, and as Boris is trying to get you up, Alice comes and takes Boris. As you're falling, she's telling you that that's who she wanted because Boris was perfect, and because she's a little messed up and twisted, like one half of her body and face looks fine, but the other half is a mismatch. So she's fixated on being perfect, and she takes Boris. And as we're diving into the 4th chapter, after our drop from the heavens, if you will, your more or less main goal is just to get Boris back from Alice. So as you're getting out of where the elevator crashed and going through these underground tunnels, which I don't know if any of you have been to an art studio lately, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't come standard. You start going into these offices and you find this one recording and a bunch of these models and documents of them making a full-blown like Disney World for Bendy, which this studio was counting on Bendy to be so big and deliver everything. But as you're making your way to this prototype amusement park, you find one of these tapes, and the guy that designed it, you come to find out that Joey Drew, the owner of the studio, is taking credit for the amusement park design, where the designer himself is very, very off-put and very upset about this, which I would be too.
You also find another one that explains that one of the previous employees of this company has rigged the doors so that you have to play a game in order to get the door open. And therefore, as Henry, you have to play these games to get this door open so that you can save Boris. And this is probably my favorite chapter. Chapter 2 was my least favorite because you just had to grab so many things and it was just really repetitive. Chapter 3 is kind of the exact opposite, where you get to play these little mini games in order to open up the doors. You go from shooting to stealth to even a boss fight, and I thought that that was pretty good. I have my issues with some of it, but I did like it compared to the rest of the chapters.
One of my favorite parts in this particular chapter is you're introduced to the projectionist again, and you're having to flip these switches, and as you're making your way out, he sees you, and so you just book it to the safe box, and as the projectionist comes up getting ready to open it, Bendy comes around the corner and they get into a little struggle, and then Bendy rips off the projectionist's head and drags the body with him. And I like it because where you thought Bendy and the projectionist were on the same level, Bendy really shows his power compared to someone else who's been through the ink machine.
I could see that. It could make him a lot more scary. Personally, I never felt more afraid of Bendy than the projectionist, just because they both kill you, like with one hit. So I didn't really see much of a difference. I did like some of the stealth mechanics, even though they were very, very bare bones. But I do have to say that while this is my favorite chapter, it does have one of my least favorite parts in the game. And what that is the boss fight. I didn't like it because if you just take a step back from the boss, you can kind of sit there for minutes and the boss won't be able to hit you. And you just wait for him to let his guard down and you can knock out his bolts. And I thought that that was kind of a missed opportunity, but I don't know exactly what the developers could do with how fast your character moves, because he never moves very fast, and it doesn't give much leniency for the developers to do much, especially with the combat. And I just thought that that was kind of, I don't know, underwhelming.
I can definitely see where you're coming from with that, but I didn't really notice an issue to where you saw with the boss fight, how you could step back and wait for an opening. I more or less looked at it as just kind of probing the boss and figuring out what worked and what didn't, because more often than not these days in video games where you come to a boss, they tell you exactly how to defeat him, to where with this boss I felt like it was called back to games of previous generation where you had to figure out what it took to defeat or hurt the boss.
So you kind of see it as like a pattern boss
Exactly.
from back in the day. I could see that. Eventually you get to Boris once you open up the door.
As you're going through this ride, it was very reminiscent of the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland. And as you're going on this ride, Alice is taunting you. And when you do get to Boris, it's like him and the beefy Terminator made a baby. He's robotic, he's buff, and he's definitely a learning curve on this boss fight for sure.
Kind of. Once again, I have my issues, and it's mainly just with the combat. I don't really like running away from an enemy until he does something to mess up. I can understand the argument, though, that it's like a pattern boss from back in the day. I think my main issue, though, is just with the speed of your character, because you're really slow. Even if you're sprinting, you're really, really slow. And I can see certain parts, specifically with this boss fight, where you are going to get hit no matter what you do. An example of that is when you have to find these little goop balls and put them inside of this thing that creates real cartoons. When you are waiting for the machine to create the thing, it leaves you open for Boris to attack you. And I didn't find that very fun.
I will say that is definitely a knock to this boss fight. I feel like it drug on a bit more than it should have. I did enjoy that he did change his attack after each time you hurt him, but I did not enjoy that most of his attacks could not be avoided. How you just have to tank the damage and there's nothing you could do.
After this fight, you are introduced to two clones of Alice and Boris. One is named Tom and the other one is named...
They're both Alice Angel, which I like what they did with that, because just listening to the tapes and getting the struggle and the drama, I personally liked it. It reminded me of Peter Jackson's King Kong, as in the beginning of that film, you have this out-of-work actress struggling to find work, and like in this situation, you have the original voice actor of Alice getting pushed out for this new voice actor, and you could see the struggle between the two, and I did really enjoy that they were two different Alices because they're the two different voice actors. This leads into
Chapter 4. Now you're being held captive between Tom and other Alice. Other Alice is like pretty nice. She takes care of you quite a bit, but Tom doesn't seem to trust you very much.
Yeah, Alice, she's very unsure about you, but she's willing to give you a fair shake, where Tom, or Mecha Boris, is just being a complete dick. As she leaves to go do whatever it is she goes to do, he's just staring at you, just swinging the axe back and forth. And as she gives you food to help you nurse you back to health, before you go to take the bowl of bacon soup, he puts his metal arm down, then pushes it on the ground. Like, he makes it very clear that you are not welcome and he does not like you. He actually tries to leave you for dead. dead.
This is where another mechanic is put into the game, where they give you this like magnifying glass that is able to see these invisible messages. One of them says not to trust Alice, and I thought that was kind of funny and kind of interesting that it would do that, because I know that this has a New Game Plus feature, and that's kind of why they give you that, is so that you can go through the game and see that. I don't really find that as much of an incentive to play the game again.
Before this playthrough, I only played through the game once. Like you say, with that glass, that's neat, but it didn't really give me a reason to go play through the game again.
This is the chapter that probably has the most combat in it. You have to face the Butcher Gang for quite a while in this one. I kind of liked that because I do like the Butcher Gang quite a bit, but there is a huge exploit. The idea of this section is that you have to get the little globs of paint and create these pipes in order to progress. The way we did it is that once you got a glob of paint, you would purposely get caught by the gang, and then you could be transported back to the machine that creates whatever you're wanting. I think this is kind of an issue because it's just easily exploitable.
It's definitely exploitable. I mean, there's a couple other sections in the game you could definitely exploit. Like, for instance, with the Boris fight, if you wanted to, instead of waiting him to spit out those blobs, you could stockpile those, create the 3 wrenches you need, and just have them at the ready, which with his boss fight, I didn't bother me as much. I just felt like it was unfair boss fight. As I stated before, I had to tank a lot of the hits, but there's definitely a lot of parts in the game where you can cheese your way through it.
One example, just to go back a little bit, was I had figured out that once you die and it respawns, the room is pretty much the same. So what I had done was I had coaxed the projection man to the top of this tower, and what it did was it caught his character inside of this loop where he couldn't get out of the tower. So after I did that, I was able to just go through the level and just grab as many things as I wanted and then come back and coax him out. And I don't know, is that game breaking to you?
I wouldn't consider it game breaking, just because I feel like it's game breaking when you have to either A, manually reset the game, or you cannot progress without doing a hard reset. But that is just my personal opinion or my personal view on game breaking.
Does it bother you?
It does a little bit, especially for someone like me that is a fan of the game, and you want to tell someone, you know, how much you like it and you really enjoy it, and when they bring up issues like this, it puts a sour taste in your mouth, which no game is perfect. Every game's gonna have its glitches and issues, but they could have just spent a little more time on the QA team, just made sure everything was a little more polished out. I think it would have helped out a lot more.
One other issue that I have is in this chapter you learn why all of these characters are real now, and it's that they wanted to have sort of moving models for them to animate. On the surface, I think that this is kind of an interesting reason for them to do that, but for me, when I thought a little bit more about it, I just was like, well, why didn't they just record these characters instead of animating them?
I could definitely see that. I mean, to be completely honest with you, that thought did not even occur to me when doing my playthroughs, but now that that's pointed out, I could see that. I got more hung up on he's created this corporate empire, and you know, if you have money, rules and laws don't apply to you. In some of these tapes, he blatantly spits out that if these things need souls, let's put them in there. I own thousands of them, which it just goes to show where the money and power has gone to his head, and he doesn't care what it takes to stay at the top.
So you would say that it's less about the reason and just more about Joey going crazy.
Exactly. It's a little bit less about why he's doing it, and I feel like it's more about he's doing it because he can.
Okay, so after this part, Tom and Alice and you have to go into the Beast Lair, essentially, and fight Bendy. This leads to this big fight that happens between you and a bunch of ink monsters and Sammy.
Which I like, because at this point you thought Bendy had just demolished him, and then he comes out and you have to fight him, and he's just getting all upset at you, saying that you abandoned him, you're supposed to save him, when he tried feeding you to Bendy. So it was under no presumption that you guys were on the same team. So it goes to show that this guy spent this much time in the ink that it's definitely started to eat and tear away at his mind and his mental capacity.
I actually did like that. I thought it was a little off-putting, but when I started to think about it, yeah, Sammy doesn't make any sense. He's just crazy. And I thought that worked. My main problem with this was, in order to get past it, I felt like we had to exploit it. I had to go into like a corner or like hide for a little bit and let the NPCs kill the other enemies in order for us to get farther.
I felt like the mass amount of enemies in that was a bit much, but I did like that now that Sammy was dead, now you have all these enemies coming after you, because you come to find out that he was the one holding them back, that he's the one and more or less controlled them by fear. And now that you took him out of the picture, now you have all these other threats to deal with. I wish this would have been put more into the beginning of the game, because it shows for every decision you do, there's a consequence that follows.
I actually completely missed that, so that makes a little bit more sense why they started to attack. I think a lot of these problems could have been fixed just by having a block button.
As much combat as that was in the game, they could have done a little bit more with it, made it a little bit more enjoyable.
I have to ask you, did you feel like whenever you swung your pipe or axe that it was responsive?
I felt it was responsive for the most part, but I felt like every now and then the hit detection of the enemies was a bit off, where a time or two it should have been dead center and it didn't, but it didn't crop up enough to where I felt like the game was cheap or game breaking.
I felt a little bit of lag sometimes, but for the most part it was kind of okay. Moving on, this is where we get to Bendy and we fight Bendy.
I really enjoyed it. You see Bendy transform into Beast Bendy, and I did think it was kind of funny how he's got these big arms, big head and torso, and these itty bitty little skinny legs. So he's just running around on his bare knuckles like an ape, and he is just storming through these hallways at mass speed, so you kind of have to peek around the corner before you make the run, but even then he could be on the other side and just round you down. The second part of the boss fight, where you kind of have to get him to hit these pipes, I like it when games do that, because you have to coax and tease the boss in order to hurt him. And as you do beat him, I did not like that his weakness was the end credits of his own cartoon. I could see why that works. I just was not too fond of it. I wish they're a little more elaborate, more secretive of how to defeat him, but that was my only complaint about that boss fight.
I thought that the first part of the boss fight was dumb. I didn't really like how you had to just stay to the side of the wall and Bendy couldn't really hit you. You just were supposed to pull these levers and eventually the door would open. The last part of the boss fight, like you said, I like it when bosses are their own worst enemy and they end up killing themselves. I thought that that was pretty cool. For me, it wasn't like a big deal that it was the end credits, because in the logic of the game, it kind of made sense. I thought that it worked really well. This is where you end up in
Joey Drew's house. At the time, you're like, what is going on? Is this a flashback? And you come to this little table with these sketches. As you look at them closer, he was not planning on you to beat Bendy. He was planning on Bendy to kill you. And as you're having this friendly conversation, he's just comparing you to how he failed with the corporate empire. You had a successful family. And at the end of it, he's saying how you always pushed him to do the right thing. And he says, you should have pushed a little harder. I really liked that. I attribute that to the Saw effect is what I like to call it. In the ending of the Saw movie, the twist I love, which if you haven't seen it, I do recommend watching at least the first one. But just that twist, and it spins your head around, and for you to say what's going on, that's when Joey tells you, come by the old workshop, I have something to show you. And it tells you that this is the conversation you had before going to the workshop, making the game do a complete 360, which I really did enjoy that aspect of it.
It creates kind of like a loop. I do like the conversation with Joey, but this is where I'm just super confused by the game, because I don't understand if, once again, is Henry a cartoon? Because he doesn't seem weirded out by other cartoons at all. And then the other thing that I just think is really weird is like everything in this game until you get to the end looks like a cartoon. So is this building a cartoon? I don't understand the rules of this universe, and that's just something that can kind of bother me sometimes. There are certain games and certain movies that I'm like okay with not understanding certain things, but with this one I just felt like there wasn't really any logic behind it. There wasn't any rules, and I didn't understand it at all. It made it hard for me to enjoy, because the whole game I'm just questioning how this whole world works. Another example is when you die, you crawl through this like hole thing with like a bunch of ink. I don't know what that means for Henry's character, if he can like come back alive, if he's a cartoon, if he's some kind of otherworldly being. I think he's just a normal guy, but I don't know. It's never explained, and I just find that kind of frustrating a little bit.
The change of design from the main game, and when you're talking with Joey, I didn't really notice it till you pointed it out, but that's true. There is no real rules or boundaries of what this world is. After you defeated Bendy, what happens? They don't really tell you. It's a huge cliffhanger, and as far as the developing studio, they've told us we're going to see a new one, but there's no real clear indication of where the series is going to go next.
So this is my question for you, Blue. I know that sometimes you're okay with no explanation, and sometimes you're okay with there being no rules. Are you okay with it with Bendy?
With my first playthrough, I was fine with it. I had a great time with it. I liked the intricate characters. And I think that's why I'm okay with the cliffhanger ending, is because the stories with the characters and the interactions they have with other characters is just so good and so intricate. I think I kind of overlooked the cliffhanger ending. I do like what they did. There's some stuff they struggled with, but I will say for this type of genre, it's definitely a step in the right direction. I think other developers should take notes of what they did here and what they didn't do and just learn from it.
So would you recommend this game?
I would highly recommend it.
I do actually agree with you. It is better than the majority of your walking sim, atmospheric, first-person horror game. But if you're like me and you kind of like your horror to be a little bit more psychological, I wouldn't really recommend it. If you like horror like PT or one of my reviews, Lost in Vivo, you're not really going to get that feel. This is more of like a jump scare thing, which is fine if you enjoy that. It's more fun and less slow, scary.
We've never really seen this genre and this style of the 1920s, 30s cartoon style. And the one thing I did enjoy of it, like you say, it's kind of jump scare. It's like intense, some thrillery sections. But for those of you that are younger viewers or you play games around a lot of other people, there's no blood, not a whole lot of gore. So it's definitely a game you don't really have to worry, is so-and-so going to be around me? Can I play this around these certain types of people? You can just pop it in and not really have to worry.
If there was a lot more people with us, because it was just me and Blue, if there were other people like screaming or had like their popcorn or something, I think that this game could probably be super fun in like a party environment. For me though, if I was to play it by myself, I don't think I would get too much enjoyment out of this. I would recommend it to people that like Outlast, but for most people that want like a challenging game with like a lot of mechanics, probably not. So I guess just me and Blue are just gonna have to disagree on this one, which is awesome.
Yeah, I'd definitely say we're going to have to agree to disagree with this one.
Let us know what you think in the comments. This is The Color Is of Gaming. Thanks for listening, and you guys have a good day.